Billionaire CEO hired the woman who could destroy him as his maid. You won't believe what happened when she walked into his investor dinner. Cole Bancroft learned early that land doesn't forgive hesitation. Neither do men with checkbooks and ambition. Tonight, standing in the great room of his Wyoming estate with its cathedral ceilings and walls of glass framing the Teton Range, he was counting on both. The room smelled of cedar smoke and expensive whiskey, the kind of scent that made investors feel like they were buying into legacy, not just luxury. 12 men in tailored suits stood scattered across his space, their laughter too loud, their watches too bright. They were here to write checks that would turn another 1,000 acres of wilderness into his crown jewel resort, the expansion that would cement the Bancroft name for another century. Outside, the September wind moved through the pines. Cole could see the mountains going purple in the twilight, that particular shade of dusk that made Jackson Hole feel like the edge of the world. "Where's the lovely Mrs. Bancroft tonight?" Gerald Whitmore asked, his tone dripping with curiosity that masked judgment. Cole's jaw tightened. He'd fielded that question for months. At 36, unmarried, building an empire alone, he'd become a liability. Investors wanted stability. Family men, not a rancher who spent more time on horseback than in boardrooms. "She's running late," Cole said smoothly, surprising himself. The lie landed before he'd thought it through. But Gerald smiled, satisfied, and turned back to his bourbon. Cole felt the weight settle, a promise made without a plan. His estate manager, Ivy, would be finishing in the kitchen now. He could picture her, sleeves rolled, dark hair twisted into that careless knot, green eyes that always seemed to see more than he wanted to show. She'd been here 4 months, efficient, quiet, the kind of person who cleaned up his life without asking questions. An idea formed. Reckless, convenient, absolutely insane. He found her in the kitchen, wiping down granite counters that already gleamed. She glanced up, and for half a second, something flickered in her expression. Wariness. "I need a favor," Cole said. Ivy set down the cloth. "That's not usually how favors start. I need you to pretend to be my date tonight." The silence stretched. She didn't laugh, didn't look offended. She just studied him with those unsettling green eyes. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. They're asking questions I don't want to answer, and I need them focused on the deal, not my personal life. So I'm set dressing? You'd be doing me a considerable favor. I'll double your pay for the month." Ivy's mouth curved, but it wasn't quite a smile. "You think you can buy my dignity for a month's wages? I think you're smart enough to recognize an opportunity when you see one." She should have walked out. Instead, she straightened, and something shifted in her posture, a kind of steel he hadn't noticed before. "One condition. I speak if spoken to. I don't play mute arm candy." "Deal. Then give me 20 minutes. But before we step deeper into this gamble, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Like this video, so this story reaches more hearts, and subscribe to follow the next journeys. Cole returned to his guests, that reckless feeling humming under his skin. Marcus Chen was explaining projected ROI, using his hands to sketch invisible graphs. Gerald was nodding, already mentally allocating capital. These were men who measured success in percentages and quarters, who saw land as inventory and wilderness as wasted potential. Cole had been one of them once. Maybe still was. But standing there, listening to them discuss the destruction of migration routes in the language of sustainable development, something uncomfortable settled in his chest. Something that felt like doubt. He just gambled on a woman he barely knew, in front of men who held his future in their portfolios. He didn't yet realize he'd gambled with something far more dangerous than money. In 20 minutes, the careful walls he'd built between who he was and who he needed to be would begin to crumble. Ivy stood in the small bedroom off the service hallway, the one Cole probably forgot existed, and stared at the single dress hanging in her closet. Charcoal gray, simple lines, the kind of thing that cost 3 months of rent back when she had rent worth paying. Back when she was Ivy Callahan, environmental attorney, the woman who'd taken on Bancroft Development in a lawsuit that made headlines across 3 states. The woman Cole Bancroft clearly didn't recognize. She'd watched him for 4 months, this man who'd inherited a legacy and built an empire on top of it. Watched him drink his coffee black at dawn, checking fence lines before most CEOs checked their email. Watched him run his hands through his hair when the numbers didn't add up. That gesture of frustration that made him look less like a billionaire and more like a man trying to hold too much weight. She told herself it was research, strategy, knowing your enemy. She hadn't expected him to be kind to his horses, hadn't expected him to remember his housekeeper's name, or ask how her week was going with something that sounded almost like genuine curiosity. Hadn't expected to find environmental impact statements on his desk at midnight, marked up with questions that mirrored the ones she'd asked in court 3 years ago. What about long-term watershed impact, migration route fragmentation, 20-year soil degradation? Questions his lawyers had systematically dismissed as irrelevant to the business case. But here, in the margins of documents he thought no one would see, Cole Bancroft was asking them himself. That discovery had complicated everything, made him 3-dimensional when she needed him to be flat, made him human when she needed him to be monstrous. Ivy pulled on the dress, zipped it with practiced efficiency. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Not because of the dress, she'd worn finer things in her previous life, but because of the expression in her own eyes. Sharp, ready. The lawyer she used to be, staring back from a future where she served coffee instead of subpoenas. She'd come to Jackson Hole with nothing. A dying car, $700, and a resume so blacklisted that even retail chains stopped returning calls. The Bancroft estate had been hiring for an estate manager, part housekeeper, part personal assistant, part invisible facilitator of a billionaire's daily life. She'd almost laughed when she saw the posting, almost kept driving. But desperation and irony have a way of aligning. The first week had been surreal. Learning the rhythms of his household, discovering that he read those impact statements late at night when he couldn't sleep, actually read them, making notes, questioning projections. She'd found one on his desk once, covered in his handwriting. Questions that would have vindicated everything she'd argued in the Silverbrook case. That moment had shattered her simple narrative of villains and victims. Ivy applied minimal makeup, pulled her hair up, leaving a few strands loose. She looked capable, professional. Dangerous in ways Cole Bancroft couldn't possibly anticipate. When she walked into the great room, conversation didn't stop dramatically, but the way attention shifts when something unexpected enters a space, a collective turning, a recalibration of assumptions. These were men accustomed to reading rooms, assessing threats and opportunities with predatory speed, and they'd just registered a new variable. Cole's expression did something complicated. Surprise, yes, but underneath it, something that looked dangerously close to appreciation. His eyes moved over her, not with calculated appraisal, but with genuine wonder, as if seeing her for the first time. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily despite its quietness. "This is Ivy Callahan." She felt the name land, saw the moment Gerald Whitmore's eyes narrowed in recognition. The name meant something to him, a memory trying to surface, a connection not quite made. But Cole didn't notice, too focused on playing the role he'd cast himself in, one hand settling lightly at the small of her back. The touch was electric, proprietary and careful at once. The gesture of a man claiming something while simultaneously treating it as precious. Ivy felt it through the thin fabric of her dress, felt the heat of his palm, the slight pressure of his fingers. felt her body respond in ways that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the inconvenient truth that Cole Bancroft, standing this close, smelled like cedar and clean sweat and something indefinably masculine. Ivy, these are the investors I mentioned. They're here to discuss the Teton Springs expansion. The resort development, Ivy said, her voice level and professional. The one that would convert 1,200 acres of protected watershed into luxury accommodations. I'm familiar with it. The room's temperature dropped 5 degrees. Cole's hand tensed at her back. A warning or a question, she couldn't tell. But she held Gerald's gaze steadily, watching calculation move behind his eyes. You've done your homework, Gerald said slowly, his tone caught between impressed and suspicious. I pay attention. It's an occupational requirement when you're responsible for someone's daily environment. And what exactly is your occupation, Miss Callahan? The trap was obvious, crude even. But before Ivy could respond, Cole's hand moved, not restraining but anchoring. A subtle communication that said, trust me, or possibly please don't destroy me in the first 5 minutes. Ivy manages my estate, Cole said smoothly. Which means she understands this land better than most people understand their own backyards. I value her perspective on everything that affects the property. It was a deflection, a protection, and it should have annoyed her, this assumption that she needed defending. Instead, Ivy felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something dangerous and entirely unwelcome. How enlightened, Gerald murmured. But his attention had already shifted back to Cole, sensing the more important conversation. Shall we move to dinner? I'm eager to discuss the timeline and your projected returns on the expansion. The group began moving toward the dining room, conversations resuming around them like water flowing past a stone. But Cole's hand stayed at Ivy's back, guiding her through the space with unconscious familiarity. As if they'd done this before. As if they belonged together in these rooms, in this life, in this elaborate performance that was starting to feel less like pretense and more like possibility. They passed through the hallway lined with photographs. 5 generations of Bancrofts standing in front of land they'd claimed, developed, transformed. Cole's great-great-grandfather beside the original ranch house. His grandfather at the groundbreaking of the first resort. His father shaking hands with a governor. And Cole himself, younger and harder looking, at the opening of the Yellowstone property that had cemented the family's reputation for luxury development. A legacy of ambition, of men who'd looked at wilderness and seen opportunity. Thank you, Cole murmured, low enough that only she could hear as they entered the dining room. For what? For saying yes. For being here. For not running when you had every reason to. Ivy glanced up at him, found his expression unguarded in the soft light. Vulnerable in a way that billionaire CEOs weren't supposed to be. The night's still young, she said. I might still run. Then I'll just have to give you reasons to stay. Their eyes met, half a second too long. Long enough for Ivy to realize she'd miscalculated something crucial about this evening, about this man. About her own capacity to maintain emotional distance from someone who was supposed to be the enemy. This wasn't just a performance, and that made it dangerous. The dining table could seat 20, but Cole had arranged for intimacy. 12 place settings clustered at one end, candlelight softening the hard edges of ambition and wealth. Crystal glasses caught the flicker of flames, casting mobile shadows across faces that were learning to trust him with their capital. Ivy sat to his right, exactly where a partner would sit, and tried not to think about how natural it felt. How his presence beside her was both unnerving and strangely solid, like standing near a fire on a cold night. Dangerous if you got too close, but impossible to walk away from when the alternative was freezing. The first course arrived, beet carpaccio with goat cheese and arugula, plated with the kind of precision that came from Cole's insistence on supporting local farms and artisan producers. Ivy had ordered these ingredients herself, had worked with the catering company to ensure everything met his standards. She knew he refused to serve Chilean sea bass because of overfishing, knew he preferred Wyoming beef from ranches he'd personally visited, knew his palate was educated, but his values were surprisingly consistent about ethical sourcing. Details that complicated the simple narrative she'd wanted to maintain. Details that made him harder to hate. The investors talked in the language of projected returns and market penetration, their voices confident with the certainty of men who'd spent decades making money. Marcus Chen dominated the conversation, sketching financial projections with his hands, painting pictures of wealth multiplication that made Gerald lean forward with interest. They discussed the Teton Springs expansion like it was already built, room occupancy rates, spa revenue streams, the wealthy clientele who would pay premium prices for proximity to wilderness they'd never actually enter. The key is exclusivity, Marcus was saying, his wine glass leaving faint rings on the polished wood. We're not building for the masses. We're building for people who can afford authentic luxury. People who want to tell their friends they stayed at a Bancroft resort in Jackson Hole. Authentic luxury, Ivy repeated quietly, not quite under her breath. Cole's hand found hers under the table, sudden, warm, covering her fingers with a pressure that felt like warning and plea combined. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, and that small touch sent electricity up her arm, made her skin feel too tight, made her aware of every point of contact between them. "You have thoughts on that, Miss Callahan?" Gerald asked, his attention swinging toward her with predatory interest. He'd been watching her all evening, she realized, looking for the crack in the facade, the moment she'd reveal whatever it was he half remembered about her name. Ivy should have smiled, should have deflected with something charming and meaningless, should have played the role Cole needed her to play, supportive, decorative, silent, except when spoken to directly. Instead, she said, "I think authenticity is more than a marketing term. It's a promise, and promises to the land are binding, whether or not the balance sheet reflects it immediately." The table went quiet. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of calculation. Men reassessing a variable they'd dismissed, recognizing threat where they'd expected decoration. Cole's hand tightened around hers, definitely a warning now. But also something else. Something that felt like curiosity. Like he was wondering what she'd say next. Whether she'd burn his carefully constructed evening to the ground or somehow make it better. Gerald leaned forward, interested despite himself. "You sound like you've thought about this. Extensively." "I've had time to think about a lot of things. 4 months of managing an estate gives you perspective on how business decisions affect the land those businesses depend on." "What did you do before estate management, Miss Callahan? You seem overqualified for the position." The question hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. Ivy felt Cole tense beside her, felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. She could lie, could maintain the fiction, could protect them both from the truth that would detonate this entire evening. "I was a lawyer," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Environmental law. I represented conservation groups in land use disputes." "Interesting career change." Gerald's smile was thin. "What brought you to domestic work?" "Circumstances, bad luck, poor choices." Ivy met his gaze steadily. "The same things that change anyone's trajectory when they make the mistake of prioritizing principle over practicality." It wasn't quite a lie, wasn't quite the truth. But it was enough to satisfy Gerald's curiosity without revealing the specific lawsuit, the specific case, the specific blacklisting that had destroyed her career for refusing to let Bancroft Development buy her silence with a settlement. Cole's thumb resumed its gentle movement across her knuckles, no longer restraining, but something closer to gratitude, or possibly wonder. As if he was seeing her clearly for the first time and finding something unexpected in the revelation. "Well," Marcus said, breaking the tension with practiced ease, That certainly explains your perspective on sustainable development. Perhaps you have thoughts on our expansion plans? Professional insights from your legal background? It was a trap, a test, an invitation to either validate their vision or reveal herself as opposition. Ivy felt the weight of 12 sets of eyes, felt Cole's attention most of all, felt the moment demanding a choice between safety and honesty. "I think," she said carefully, choosing each word like stepping stones across dangerous water, "that the Teton Springs expansion as currently designed would fragment critical wildlife corridors and compromise watershed integrity that serves 3 counties downstream. I think luxury and sustainability aren't mutually exclusive, but they require genuine commitment, not just branding and marketing language. I think you have an opportunity to build something unprecedented if you're willing to prioritize long-term ecological health over short-term profit maximization." The silence this time was absolute. Ivy felt Cole staring at her, felt the shock radiating from him like heat. She'd just challenged every investor at this table, questioned the project they'd come here to fund, and done it with enough technical specificity to reveal she knew exactly what she was talking about. "That's quite a critique," Gerald said slowly, "from someone who manages Mr. Bancroft's household." "I manage his estate. That includes understanding what makes it valuable, and what would destroy that value permanently." Ivy turned to look at Cole directly, finding his expression caught between alarm and something that looked dangerously like admiration. "Some things, once broken, can't be repaired. Some damage is permanent. The question is whether profit today is worth devastation tomorrow." She'd gone too far. Knew it instantly. These men hadn't come here to be lectured by the help, to have their vision questioned by someone who cleaned and organized. Cole's carefully constructed evening was collapsing, and she was the one demolishing it with brutal honesty. But Cole's hand stayed wrapped around hers, warm and steady. And when he spoke, his voice carried a note she'd never heard before. Something raw and honest that cut through the performance. "She's right," he said quietly. Gerald's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me?" "Ivy's right. The current expansion plan has serious problems I've been ignoring because they're inconvenient. Problems that serve our immediate financial interests but compromise long-term integrity of the land we claim to be stewarding." Cole's gaze swept the table, meeting each investor's eyes. "Maybe we need to rethink fundamentally what we're building and why we're building it." The room exploded into conversation. Protests, questions, demands for clarification. But Ivy barely heard it. She was too focused on the man beside her, the way his hand gripped hers like an anchor, the way he'd just chosen her truth over their money, her principles over their profit, chosen her over them. The house fell silent after the last set of taillights disappeared down the long gravel drive, red pinpoints swallowed by darkness and distance. Ivy stood at the window, watching Wyoming night reclaim the space where wealth and ambition had temporarily intruded. The mountains were invisible now, but she could feel their presence. Ancient, immovable, indifferent to the small dramas of people who thought they owned land that would outlast them by millennia. Behind her, she heard Cole's footsteps returning from the driveway. Steady, deliberate, the walk of a man who'd spent the last 30 minutes saying goodbye to investors while calculating the cost of what had just happened. Ivy braced herself for anger, for accusations, for the reasonable fury of someone whose carefully constructed evening she'd demolished with brutal honesty. Instead, when Cole spoke, his voice carried something that sounded almost like wonder. "You were incredible tonight." Ivy turned slowly, found him standing in the doorway with his jacket off, tie loosened, looking younger and more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. The billionaire veneer had cracked, revealing something raw underneath. "I destroyed your deal." "No, you told the truth." Cole moved closer, each step measured. "You saw what I've been pretending not to see for months. What I've been justifying and rationalizing because it was easier than admitting my expansion plans would cause exactly the kind of damage you described. That doesn't change the fact that I cost you millions tonight. Probably your relationship with Gerald and half those investors. Maybe. Or maybe you saved me from building something I'd regret for the rest of my life. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell cedar and clean sweat, the scent of a man who worked for what he had. Ivy, how did you know? About the watershed, the migration corridors, the specific environmental impacts. That wasn't casual knowledge. That was deep expertise. This was it. The moment she'd been simultaneously dreading and engineering for 4 months. The moment the truth would either destroy what was building between them or forge it into something real. Because I've studied those impact assessments, Ivy said quietly. I've read every environmental survey, every geological report, every wildlife migration study relevant to Bancroft development properties. I've memorized them, actually. Word for word in some cases. Cole's brow furrowed. Why would you? My name is Ivy Callahan, she interrupted, needing to say it all at once before courage failed. 3 years ago, I was the lead attorney on a lawsuit against Bancroft Development. We sued to block your resort expansion into the Silverbrook protected wetlands. I lost. My firm buried the case to protect their relationship with your family, and I was systematically blacklisted from every major practice in the region. I spent 2 years working minimum wage jobs before I ran out of money entirely and options completely. When I saw your posting for an estate manager, I almost kept driving. Almost didn't apply, but I was desperate and broke and... She paused, forced herself to meet his eyes. And maybe part of me wanted to understand the enemy, to see if you were the monster I needed you to be. She watched the words land, watched Cole's expression cycle through confusion, recognition, understanding, and finally something that looked like betrayal. He took a step back, instinctive, protective, putting space between them that felt wider than the physical distance. The Silverbrook case, he said slowly, his voice hollow. That was you. You were the lead attorney who argued we were destroying irreplaceable wetland ecosystems for profit. That was me. You sued my company, lost everything, and then came to work for me as... what? Revenge? An elaborate scheme to destroy me from the inside? No. The word came out sharp, desperate. No, Cole. I came to work for you because I was desperate. Because you were the only one hiring who didn't require references or extensive background checks. Because the universe has a sick sense of irony, and I needed the money to survive. Ivy's laugh was bitter. The revenge angle would have required me to actually hate you. And that turned out to be surprisingly difficult. Cole ran a hand through his hair. That gesture of frustration she'd learned to recognize. That tell that revealed when he was processing more than he could easily handle. Why didn't you tell me? In 4 months you never thought to mention that you'd sued my company? Would you have hired me if I had? He stopped. I don't know. Probably not. No. Exactly. So I stayed quiet. Told myself I'd work here for a few months, save enough money to leave Wyoming entirely, start over somewhere that didn't remember my name or my failures. Ivy wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the house. But then you turned out to be complicated. You fed your horses apples and talked to them like they understood. You read environmental impact statements at 3 a.m. because you couldn't sleep until the numbers made sense. You asked me how my week was going, like you actually cared about the answer, like I was a person instead of just staff. Of course I cared. You were supposed to be easy to hate, Cole. You were supposed to be the villain, the corporate raider who destroyed ecosystems for quarterly profits, the legacy son who inherited wealth and wielded it like a weapon without conscience. Her voice broke. And you just weren't. You were human and complicated and genuinely troubled by the same questions that destroyed my career. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things they hadn't said and couldn't take back. Cole's jaw worked like he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded like grief. "So tonight," Cole said finally, "everything you said about the land, about sustainability, about damage being permanent, that was real. That came from genuine conviction, not manipulation. That was always real. It's the only thing about me that was completely honest from the beginning. And us?" The question came out barely above a whisper. "This thing that's been building between us for months. Was that real? Or was that just you playing a role, getting close to gather ammunition?" Ivy felt tears burn behind her eyes, felt the weight of her deception collide with the unexpected truth of her feelings. "I don't know how to separate them anymore. I started out playing a role, yes, the efficient housekeeper, the invisible help who kept your life organized. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being performance and started being survival. A way to be close to you without risking the truth that would make you hate me. I don't hate you. You should." "Well, I don't." Cole's voice carried an edge of anger now. Not at her, but at circumstance, at complexity, at the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. "I'm furious. Yes. I feel manipulated and deceived and like an idiot for not recognizing your name, for not connecting the dots between the Silverbrook lawsuit and the woman organizing my library. But I don't hate you, Ivy. I can't. Because the woman who stood in my dining room tonight and challenged 12 investors to their faces, that wasn't performance. That was you. The real you. And that woman is extraordinary. Don't do this." Ivy's voice broke completely. "Don't make this about who I am or who you think I could be. Don't romanticize a situation that's fundamentally broken." "Why not?" "Because I'm the woman who tried to destroy your legacy. Because you're the man whose company destroyed my career. Because tomorrow, those investors are going to wake up and realize what happened tonight. And they're going to demand answers. They're going to investigate me, Cole. Gerald already half remembers my name. They're going to find out exactly who I am and what I did. And when they do, you'll have to choose. Your credibility with them, your business relationships, your entire professional reputation, or whatever this complicated thing is between us. Then I choose you." The words landed like a physical blow. Ivy stared at him, searching for any sign of insincerity and finding only raw honesty in his expression. "You don't mean that. You can't mean that." "I do. I absolutely do. I choose you over them, over the deal, over an expansion that would destroy something irreplaceable for profit I don't actually need." Cole moved closer, closing the distance she'd tried to create. "Ivy, I've spent my entire life building what I thought was legacy, expanding the empire, adding zeros to balance sheets, proving I was worthy of the Bancroft name. And tonight, you showed me that everything I've been building is hollow. That legacy isn't measured in acres or dollars, but in what we choose to protect when protection costs us everything. You're going to regret this." Tears spilled over despite her best efforts. "When you lose the investors, when your family turns on you, when you realize what choosing me has cost, you're going to regret it. Maybe." Cole reached up, cupped her face with both hands, his touch gentle despite the intensity in his eyes. "Or maybe I'll regret every year I spent building the wrong things. But I won't regret this. I won't regret choosing honesty over performance. I won't regret choosing you." Ivy closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite every instinct screaming at her to run, to protect herself, to avoid the inevitable pain when this impossible situation collapsed. "I don't know how to do this. How to be with someone who represents everything I fought against. Then we'll figure it out together. Slowly. messily, without pretending to be anything we're not. No more performances? No more performances, Cole confirmed. Just truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us. He was offering her something she'd stopped believing existed, genuine partnership built on honesty instead of convenience, and it terrified her. Ivy didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. She sat in her small room off the service hallway, the room she'd occupied for 4 months, the space that had been sanctuary and prison combined, watching the Teton Range emerge from darkness with agonizing slowness. The mountains materialized in stages, first just a deeper shadow against the sky, then a suggestion of peaks, finally resolving into the sharp, snow-capped ridges that had witnessed 100 years of Bancroft ambition and compromise. Somewhere in this sprawling house, Cole was probably experiencing his own sleepless night. Lying awake, processing revelations, calculating costs, maybe regretting the impulsive decision he'd made to choose her over 12 men with checkbooks and expectations. The rational part of Ivy's mind insisted she should leave before dawn, pack her few belongings, slip out while the house still slept, spare them both the messy morning after of last night's emotional collision. But she'd spent 3 years running. From the lawsuit, from her failures, from the uncomfortable truth that she'd let institutional pressure override personal integrity when her firm had buried the Silverbrook case. And Cole's words kept echoing in her mind. No more performances. Just truth. Even when it's uncomfortable. So at 7, when she heard movement in the kitchen, Ivy made herself get up. Changed from the gray dress, still draped over her single chair, a reminder of last night's performance turned confession, into jeans and a worn flannel shirt. Her uniform, her armor, the costume of someone who'd chosen manual labor over pride because survival required compromise with dignity. She found Cole at the stove, scrambling eggs with the focused intensity of a man who needed something productive to do with his hands. He'd clearly not slept either. His hair was disheveled in ways that suggested repeated running of hands through it, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his eyes carrying the hollowed-out look of someone who'd spent the night wrestling with uncomfortable questions about identity and inheritance. "Morning," Ivy said quietly, her voice rough from crying and sleeplessness. He turned, and for a moment they just looked at each other. No pretense, no performance. Just 2 exhausted people standing in a kitchen filled with morning light and the weight of everything they'd finally said aloud. "I didn't sign the deal," Cole said without preamble. Ivy's breath caught. "What?" "I called Gerald at 6 this morning. Told him I was pulling out of the expansion, that I couldn't move forward with a project I wasn't willing to defend. Not just to investors, but to the one person whose opinion actually mattered to me." He set down the spatula, wiped his hands on a kitchen towel with nervous precision. "I told him I needed to rethink what legacy means, what stewardship actually requires, what I want my name to represent when I'm gone. Cole, you just walked away from hundreds of millions of dollars. I walked away from building something that would destroy what makes this place worth inheriting." He moved toward her, each step deliberate and careful, as if approaching something wild that might bolt. "Ivy, you were right about everything. The expansion would fragment migration routes, contaminate watersheds, destroy something irreplaceable for profit that would sit in bank accounts I'd never spend. And I knew that. I've always known that. But it's easier to build empires than to admit you're building them on foundations that won't hold moral scrutiny." Ivy felt tears threaten again. Different tears now. Not grief, but something closer to overwhelming recognition. "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to sacrifice your deal for my principles." "It's not about your principles. It's about mine. Or rather, about developing principles that actually align with who I want to be, instead of who I was expected to become." Cole stopped in front of her, close but not touching, giving her space to process. "I was 23 when I inherited this place. 23 and terrified and convinced that the only way to honor my family was to expand everything they'd built, to add my own chapter to a legacy that felt more like obligation than opportunity. So I built, developed, expanded, proved I could be worthy of a name I never asked for but couldn't escape. Legacy is complicated, Ivy said softly. Legacy is a trap if you're not careful. It becomes about maintaining what was instead of creating what should be. Cole's laugh was self-deprecating, tinged with something that sounded like relief. And then you showed up. This woman I didn't recognize, who reorganized my life and called me out without saying a word. Who saw through every justification I'd built, every rationalization I'd deployed to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about what I was building and why. I didn't mean to. Yes, you did, Cole interrupted gently. You meant to challenge me. Maybe not consciously at first, maybe not deliberately. But your presence here has been a constant question I couldn't ignore. Why does my housekeeper know more about environmental impact than my own development staff? Why does she look at architectural plans with the eye of someone who's read every geological survey? Why does she flinch when I talk about expansion, like the words cause physical pain? Ivy wrapped her arms around herself, defensive and vulnerable at once. I should have told you from the beginning. Should have been honest about who I was and why I came here. Probably. But honesty is complicated when you're desperate. When you need a job and admitting your history means losing your only option for survival. Cole reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, giving her time to pull away if she needed to. When she didn't, his hand cupped her cheek with infinite gentleness. I'm not angry about the deception, Ivy. I'm angry about the circumstances that made deception necessary, about the blacklisting, the institutional pressure, the way my company's lawyers crushed a legitimate environmental lawsuit to protect profit margins. You weren't personally responsible for that. You were, 25? 26? When the Silverbrook case went to court. 27, and I was absolutely responsible. I signed off on the legal strategy. I authorized the settlement approach that pressured your firm. I made the choice to prioritize expansion over environmental protection, because that's what Bancrofts do. Cole's voice carried the weight of confession, of truths he'd been avoiding for years. I told myself it was necessary, that the economic benefits outweighed the ecological costs, that we'd implement safeguards, monitoring systems, mitigation strategies, all the language of responsible development that sounds impressive in boardrooms and means nothing in practice. Cole, no, let me finish, please. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, catching a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I've spent 3 years becoming a better developer, implementing real environmental protections, funding conservation easements, supporting wildlife corridors and watershed preservation. Not because I suddenly developed a conscience, but because I kept having these dreams, nightmares really, about standing in front of destroyed wetlands and realizing I'd traded something irreplaceable for quarterly earnings reports. Ivy stared at him, seeing clearly the internal war he'd been fighting, the tension between inherited expectation and personal integrity, the impossible weight of trying to honor family legacy while developing personal ethics that contradicted everything that legacy represented. The changes you made, she said slowly, the conservation easements, the watershed protections, those came after Silverbrook? Those came because of Silverbrook, because of you and your arguments. Cole's smile was sad and honest. I didn't know your name, didn't know you personally, but your lawsuit changed me, made me question everything I'd been building and why. The revelations settled between them, complicated and painful, and somehow redemptive. They'd been influencing each other for years without knowing it. I don't know what to do with this information, Ivy admitted. You don't have to do anything except decide if who I'm trying to become is someone worth believing in. That's not fair. You're putting too much weight on me. No. I'm asking if you're willing to take a risk on someone who's still figuring out how to be better than he was. Cole's hand slid from her face to capture both her hands. Ivy, I can't undo the damage, but I can commit to building something different going forward. He pulled her close, and Ivy let herself be held while she cried, for the career she'd lost, for the years she'd spent running, for the unexpected grace of being seen clearly and chosen anyway. I'm terrified, she managed. Me too. This could still fall apart. Then we lose it together and build something new. They stood in the kitchen while the sun climbed higher. Eventually, Ivy's tears subsided. Okay, she said. Okay? I'll try. I'll risk believing in this. She managed to smile. But if you ever build on protected wetlands again, I'm suing you myself. Cole laughed. Deal. He kissed her then, soft and real and tasting of coffee and courage. And Ivy let herself fall into it, let herself believe that sometimes the enemy becomes the partner. The boardroom in Jackson smelled like expensive leather and old money, that particular combination of polish and privilege that marked spaces where serious decisions had been made for decades. Cole sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by 7 board members who'd built the Bancroft empire alongside his father and grandfather. Men in their 60s and 70s, wearing suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Faces carved from decades of making hard decisions and expecting deference from younger generations. Thomas Bancroft, Cole's uncle, majority shareholder, and the closest thing to a patriarch the family had left, sat directly across from him, expression carved from granite and disappointment. Ivy sat to Cole's right, not as decoration this time, not as the housekeeper playing pretend partner, but as the newly hired environmental consultant for Bancroft Development, the woman who would help him reimagine what legacy could mean when built on integrity instead of exploitation. She wore a simple navy suit, her own, purchased from savings, and her hair pulled back in a professional knot that somehow made her look both fierce and elegant. Cole had insisted she be here, had made it clear that any future discussion of Bancroft Development would include her perspective, her expertise, her voice in decisions that had previously been made exclusively by men who measured success in dollars and acres. The board members had not received this news well. You've lost your mind, Thomas said flatly, his voice carrying the weight of family authority and personal disappointment. Walking away from a $200 million expansion to hire the lawyer who tried to destroy us? The woman who cost us 18 months of legal fees and negative press coverage? She tried to protect something worth protecting, Cole replied, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of steel Ivy had rarely heard. There's a fundamental difference between destruction and accountability. Ivy held us accountable, and she was right to do it. Semantics. The investors are furious. Gerald's threatening to pull funding from all Bancroft projects, not just Teton Springs, but everything. The Yellowstone development, the Aspen renovation, even the established properties. Thomas leaned forward, his hands flat on the polished table. You're jeopardizing the entire empire over what? Principle? Environmental concerns that every other developer manages to navigate successfully? Other developers navigate them by paying fines and implementing minimal compliance. I'm choosing a different path. One that actually aligns actions with the values we claim to hold. Because of her. Thomas's gaze swung to Ivy, cold and assessing. Miss Callahan, you've been in Cole's employment for what? 4 months? And already you've convinced him to dismantle everything 3 generations of Bancrofts built. Ivy met his stare evenly, refusing to be diminished. I haven't dismantled anything, Mr. Bancroft. I've asked questions. Real questions about environmental impact, long-term sustainability, and what stewardship actually requires when you're dealing with irreplaceable ecosystems. If those questions threaten your business model, Perhaps the model was built on faulty foundations to begin with. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. One of the other board members, Richard Chambers, who'd been friends with Cole's grandfather, made a sound of disgust. "You have no right to question how this family does business. No right to waltz in here and undermine generations of careful work." "She has every right," Cole interrupted, his voice hard as the granite that formed the Tetons visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Because I've given it to her. Ivy understands this land better than anyone in this room, including me. She spent years studying environmental impact, fighting for protections that actually matter, watching corporations prioritize quarterly earnings over ecological preservation. And yes, she lost that fight against us. But she was right, and we were wrong." The admission hung in the air, stark and irrevocable. Ivy felt the shock ripple through the room, not because they didn't know Cole had changed his positions, but because he'd just admitted wrongdoing in front of the entire board, had acknowledged that Bancroft Development, under his leadership and theirs, had made ethically compromised decisions. "You can't mean that," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I absolutely mean it. The Silverbrook expansion should never have been approved. The environmental impact studies we commissioned were deliberately designed to minimize concerns and maximize approval odds. We knew, I knew, that the development would damage protected wetlands. And I chose to proceed anyway because profit seemed more important than principle. I was wrong." "Every development has environmental impact," Richard protested. "That's the nature of progress. We implement mitigation strategies, we fund conservation offsets, we follow all legal requirements. We do the minimum required by law while lobbying to weaken those laws," Ivy interjected, her voice sharp with barely contained frustration. "That's not stewardship. That's exploitation dressed in the language of responsibility. And Mr. Bancroft knows it, which is why he's proposing something fundamentally different." Cole stood, pulling architectural plans from his briefcase. New ones, redesigned over late nights with Ivy's consultation, incorporating everything she'd argued for in the Silverbrook lawsuit and more. He spread them across the table with deliberate care, forcing the board members to look at what he was proposing. "This is Teton Springs 2.0, he said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd made a decision and would defend it regardless of cost. Half the original capacity, triple the sustainability measures, zero net impact on migration routes or watershed systems, and a permanent conservation easement on 3,000 acres adjacent to the resort. Land we own, land we're removing permanently from any future development consideration." Thomas stared at the plans like they'd personally offended him. "That's financial suicide. You're proposing we voluntarily reduce our profit potential by more than 60% while simultaneously restricting future development options that could be worth hundreds of millions. I'm proposing we build something that will last. Something my children, if I'm lucky enough to have them, won't be ashamed to inherit. Something that proves luxury and sustainability aren't mutually exclusive when you prioritize genuine ecological responsibility over maximum resource extraction." "This is idealism, not business," someone muttered from the far end of the table. "Then maybe business needs more idealism," Ivy said quietly, drawing every eye to her. "The clients you're trying to attract, genuinely wealthy people, not just rich ones. They're looking for authentic experiences. They want connection to wilderness, not proximity to its corpse. They're willing to pay premium prices for developments that actively protect what makes a place special, instead of destroying it in the process of providing access. The next generation of wealth holders understands ecological limits in ways previous generations didn't. If Bancroft Development doesn't adapt, you'll be irrelevant in 20 years. The board erupted, voices overlapping, arguments colliding. Cole let it run for 30 seconds before cutting through. Enough. Silence fell instantly. I know what I'm asking, Cole continued. I know this changes everything. I know it reduces short-term profitability, but I'd rather build something small and sustainable than something massive and destructive. I'd rather be the Bancroft who chose principle over profit. Even if it cost you your seat on this board? Thomas asked. Cole's jaw tightened. Even then, you're choosing her over your family. No, I'm choosing integrity over convenience. I'm choosing the future over the past. And yes, I'm choosing Ivy, because she represents courage I've been lacking. The courage to stand for something even when it costs everything. Cole found Ivy's hand. She lost her career for refusing to compromise, lost 3 years to consequences she didn't deserve, and she's still standing, still fighting, still believing that doing the right thing matters. I'll need to put this to a vote, Thomas said finally. But understand, if you pursue this, you'll do it without family financial backing, without our capital, without the Bancroft name providing automatic credibility. I understand completely. You'll struggle, potentially fail. Then I'll fail building something I believe in. Thomas studied him for a long moment. You're your mother's son. She always had more principle than sense. She would have been proud of this idiocy. Cole's composure cracked slightly. His mother had died when he was 19. The board will vote within 2 weeks, Thomas continued. I can't promise support, but I'll consider your arguments. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't complete rejection. The board filed out. When the door closed, Cole sank back. Well, he said. That went as expected. Ivy turned to him, searching for regret and finding only exhaustion and relief. This could fail. I already have everything that matters. Cole pulled her close. Right here. That's terrible business strategy. Good thing I hired a consultant. Ivy laughed despite everything, because Cole had defended her, had stood for principles that cost him institutional support, had chosen her truth over family approval. So what now? Now we rebuild, together. Ivy kissed him, slow and deep and full of promise. Through the windows, the Tetons stood witness to 2 people choosing principle over profit, integrity over inheritance. 18 months later, Ivy stood on the ridge overlooking what used to be slated for Teton Springs expansion, 1,200 acres that previous generations of Bancrofts had considered inevitable development territory. Instead, the land stretched wild and untouched beneath the October sky. 3,000 acres in permanent conservation easement, protected by an agreement between Bancroft Conservation Development and the Western Lands Conservation Alliance. A coalition Ivy now directed as executive director, funded by Cole's scaled-down but surprisingly profitable sustainable resort model and grants from conservation organizations who'd watched their transformation with skeptical hope that had gradually become enthusiastic support. The air smelled like sage and coming snow. October in Wyoming painted the aspens gold against evergreen, and the elk were already moving through their ancient migration corridors, unbothered by development that would never come. Ivy had spent the morning tracking their movement with trail cameras, collecting data for next year's strategies. Behind her, footsteps on the trail. Cole appeared, carrying thermoses of coffee, wearing the same flannel jacket from that first honest morning. He'd traded his Billionaire's wardrobe for work clothes months ago. Brought reinforcements, he said, handing her a thermos. You're late. I said sunrise. Negotiating with the contractor. The visitor center is running 15% over budget. Ivy smiled. The visitor center, their compromise between education and economy. A facility that would teach guests about conservation while generating revenue. Not an empire. Just something honest. We'll make it work. We always do. We do, don't we? Cole settled beside her, his arm coming around her waist with easy familiarity. The elk count is up 12%. I saw, and the watershed analysis came back clean. The land is healing now that we've stopped treating it like inventory. They stood together, watching the valley fill with light. The visitor center was taking shape, their compromise that would keep conservation work funded. It had taken 8 months to secure funding after the board vote went exactly as Thomas predicted, 5-2 against, with Thomas casting one supporting vote for my nephew's integrity, even while questioning his judgment. The other members demanded Cole's resignation. He'd provided it without hesitation. The first 6 months were terrifying. They'd lived on Cole's savings while Ivy wrote grant proposals and Cole rebuilt his network. They'd fought about money and strategy. But each small success built credibility. Conservation organizations who'd viewed Bancroft development as adversaries slowly recognized Cole's transformation as genuine. The breakthrough came when Gerald Whitmore approached them. He'd been watching their progress. "I was wrong about you," Gerald had said. "You've built something remarkable." Now, standing on the ridge, Cole could see the results. The scaled-down resort operating at 93% capacity with a waiting list. The conservation easement protecting corridors. The visitor center taking shape. And most importantly, a business model proving sustainable luxury was profitable when executed with integrity. "Your uncle called yesterday," Ivy said. "Thomas wants to talk about rejoining the board. Our board, the new one." Cole was quiet, processing. Thomas had been supportive from distance, offering advice, making introductions, maintaining boundaries. The offer to formally rejoin represented something significant. "What did you tell him?" "That it was your decision, that I'd support whatever you chose." "What do you think?" Ivy turned to face him. "I think Thomas is a complicated man who's watching his nephew build something more valuable than money. I think reconciliation is possible, but only if he's willing to meet you where you are now." "When did you become so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just weren't paying attention." Cole laughed, genuine, full. The sound of someone who'd stopped performing. They stayed until the coffee cooled. Two people who'd started as adversaries and become partners through choosing honesty over convenience. "Do you ever regret it?" Ivy asked, walking away. "Never." Immediate, without hesitation. "I regret the years building wrong things. But not this. This is legacy. Real legacy." Ivy leaned into him. Over the past year, they'd built more than an organization. They'd built a life. They'd moved in together 6 months ago, not to Cole's estate, which he'd sold to fund conservation, but to a smaller house on the edge of protected land. "I love you," Ivy said. "I love you too. Every stubborn, brilliant, infuriating part." "I'm not infuriating. You reorganized my filing system last week. Again. Your system was chaos. Again." They laughed together, the sound carrying across the valley. Later, after meetings about funding and permits, they would drive to the jeweler in Jackson where Cole had commissioned something special. Not a ring bought to impress, but Montana silver and an ethically sourced diamond, designed to represent their shared commitment to building beauty without exploitation. He would propose that evening in the horse barn where they'd first stopped pretending, where Ivy had agreed to play a role that transformed into truth. And Ivy would say yes, not because Cole had wealth or because he'd sacrificed his empire, but because he'd become someone worth loving, because he'd chosen to grow, to transform, to build something meaningful. But that was hours away. For now, they stood watching wilderness stay wild, living proof that battles fought with integrity instead of capital were worth winning. The mountains had witnessed 100 years of Bancroft ambition. Now they witnessed something different. Two people who'd chosen principle over profit, partnership over performance, and the difficult work of building legacy through protection instead of exploitation. "Thank you," Cole said quietly. "For what?" "For being impossible to hate. For challenging everything. For showing me what integrity looks like when it costs everything." Ivy reached up, cupped his face. You are worthy. Not because of what you've built, but because you keep choosing honesty even when it's hard. They kissed there on the ridge, slow and deep, marking not just passion, but profound partnership. Ready to head back? He asked. Ready. Conference call at 2. Contractor at 3. Dinner with Thomas at 6. Such is the glamorous life of conservation development. Would you trade it? Ivy looked at the protected valley one last time. Not for anything in the world. They hiked down together. Two people who'd transformed conflict into collaboration, who'd chosen truth over performance. Behind them, the Tetons stood silent, witnesses to the revolutionary act of dismantling an empire to build something better. In the end, this story isn't really about a billionaire, a lawsuit, or even a second chance at love. It's about the courage to dismantle the empires we inherit when those empires are built on foundations we can't defend. About understanding that legacy isn't measured in acres conquered or profits maximized, but in what we choose to protect when protection costs us everything we thought defined success. It's about two people who started as enemies and became allies through choosing truth over performance. Who learned that real love doesn't ask you to be smaller. It demands you become braver, more honest, more willing to risk comfort for meaning. Cole didn't sacrifice his empire for Ivy. He sacrificed the version of himself that measured worth in expansion. And Ivy didn't forgive him despite his privilege. She challenged him to use that privilege in service of something larger than legacy. This is a story about choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. About standing on ridges at sunrise knowing that the land you're protecting will outlast any empire built on its destruction. About understanding that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is tear down what previous generations built and start again. This time with integrity as foundation. Because real legacy isn't about what we accumulate. It's about what we protect, what we restore, what we leave wilder than we found it. It's about having the courage to say, this far and no further. To draw lines that honor ecology over economy, preservation over profit. Cole and Ivy discovered that sustainable development isn't an oxymoron when approached with genuine commitment. That conservation and community can thrive together. That the land responds to care with abundance. And that abundance, measured in healthy ecosystems rather than quarterly earnings, is the only wealth that actually endures. If this journey moved you, if it made you question what legacy really means in a world where extraction has been normalized and stewardship has become radical, leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. Tell me, would you have had the courage to walk away from everything you'd inherited for something better? Would you have chosen principle over profit, truth over performance? Would you have the courage to stand before family and investors and say, this far and no further? To draw lines that protect what matters even when those lines cost you institutional support and financial certainty. And if you believe that some stories don't just entertain but challenge us to examine our own definitions of success. To question whether we're building legacies of accumulation or stewardship, whether we're measuring worth in profit or protection, then subscribe. Because the next journey will ask even harder questions about what it means to love, to choose, to become someone worthy of the legacy we'll inevitably leave. The wilderness is watching. The mountains are patient. The land remembers everything. The only question that matters is, when future generations stand where we stand now, will they thank us for what we preserved or curse us for what we destroyed? Choose wisely. Build honestly. Love fiercely. And remember that sometimes the smallest empires, the ones built on integrity rather than expansion, are the only ones that truly matter.